When we come to science, we have to check ourselves and be sure not to talk about culminations. We have to remind ourselves not to talk about summations. Even though all of our experience leads us to believe, and all of our mind leads us to conceive, and everything which we are to confirm that we have arrived somewhere, we have to forestall those tendencies. Science becomes very dangerous when it has the hubris, when it has the pride of having arrived. The power of science is so overwhelming that all of our education is necessary to prepare us from the ground up, as it were, to have this ability to forestall the erroneous, projective leap of erroneous faith that science is something. Though it is in fact something, we have to deny it. And the only way to do this is to remind ourselves that it's only provisional. And so one finds in scientific mentality in the late 20th century, one talks about probabilities, not certainties. One doesn't talk about the absolute, but one talks about the probable. And it's interesting, as a sidelight, that one of the great developers of probability theory was John Maynard Keynes, who is largely remembered for his economic theories, but his work on probability was very formative. But the most formative mind of all in science for the probabilistic quality of the cosmos is Niels Bohr. More than Einstein, more than anyone else, Niels Bohr. And so we're taking Niels Bohr as one of our figures to begin science with. I used to use a book, The Philosophy of Niels Bohr, The Framework of Complementarity, but it's published in North Holland and was very difficult to obtain. So now we're using a different volume. We're using a book which is in paperback from Oxford University Press, and its title is Niels Bohr's Times. And you can find copies of this. I noted that the branches of Borders have this in stock, paperback. Abraham Pius was a physicist and very famous, and he wrote a book on Einstein in his book, Niels Bohr's Times in Physics, Philosophy, and Polity. And so we want to take a look at Niels Bohr. One of Bohr's most enduring achievements was to bring the term quantum into everyday language. And when one runs across volumes like Niels Bohr Centennial Conferences, 1985, you find the Tau Te symbol on the cover. More profound than the Tao of physics is Niels Bohr's contribution. And one finds that he even incorporated the Tau Te symbol on his family crest. The Tao of physics, the quantum universe, owes a lot of its intelligibility to Niels Bohr. And we will see as we go along that in order to bring this enormously powerful thought, this enormously difficult to imagine universe, this differential cosmos, into play for us, we need to have an outrigger, as it were, to this very precarious canoe. And the outrigger is Mary Leakey. And so we're going to take Mary Leakey's book, Discovering the Past, and it also is in paperback. And so I will pair Mary Leakey with Niels Bohr. Mary Leakey, as the outrigger here, is in no way inferior to Niels Bohr. While Niels Bohr went into millions and billions of levels of power, Mary Leakey went into millions and billions of years of background to man. And this, perhaps, is one of the things that we should keep in mind. In the 20th century, our frame of reference for ourselves has increased to such an extent that there is no way to measure it. And so in mathematics, one uses the term asymptotic. It means a line that rises so quickly that it goes straight up off the graph, asymptotically. At the end of the 19th century, most of the thinking, intelligent men and women on the planet would have believed in their heart of hearts that man was created with Adam, and that Adam could be dated to 4004 BC. There were very few people who seriously would have doubted this. We know now that if you took it to 4 million BC, would be more like the origins of our species, our kind. So from 4,000 to 4 million, 1,000 times the scale is what we have to deal with now, and largely due to Mary Leakey, though her husband, LSB Leakey, was more famous during his lifetime. It's apparent that she was the formative person all the time, in the background, very quiet. And so Mary Leakey is very much on a same par and level as Niels Bohr. So we take a man and a woman to begin science for ourselves. It's interesting that LSB Leakey's first book was called Before Adam, and that Mary Leakey did the illustrations for it. Now I want to come back to Bohr for just a minute, and then we'll go to Mary Leakey, and then we'll come back. I'm going to alternate between the two of them. First, Bohr. We need to have a little bit of background for ourselves. And it's difficult to have this background because it is so complex, and it is difficult to present unless your consciousness has raised itself to a level where you can hear without imagination. And to hear without imagination is very, very difficult. All of our education has been to train you, to educate you, so that you can have a vision without imagination. But whether it has taken hold or not is largely dependent on your ability to have applied yourself here. The first example is light. Nothing is more apparent in this universe than light. The quantum of light is a photon. A photon, in terms of 1995 physics, is a particle and a wave. As a particle, it is a kind of a particle. It belongs to a family of particles. And that family of particles are called gauge bosons, which is completely meaningless to most people. Along with the photon in the gauge bosons, there are several other particles. But in order to describe those particles, instead of talking about how wide they are, how deep they are, instead of talking about them in terms of space, or color, or shape, they are talked about in terms of their mass, and their mass is measured not in pounds, not in grams, but in electrical energy, volts, on scale of billions. So that when one talks about the family, the gauge boson family, to which the quanta of light, the photon, belongs, that family includes a member called the Z particle that was only found in 1983. The Z particle has a mass of 93 gigavolts. Not megavolts, gigavolts. It's like the computers that have gigabyte capacity. So it's a lot of zeros, and it means that this particle can only be seen when one's vision is raised to that energy level. And unless you can raise your energy level of vision to 93 gigavolts, the Z particle does not become apparent. And until 1983, it was not ever apparent. What is the mass of the photon? 0. The photon is even more mysterious than the Z or another family member, the W particle, which is only 83 gigavolts. In order to see light, one has to have vision capacity of mass 0. This takes super yogi indeed. Because if you have anything in the way, if you have any imagination whatsoever as a frame of reference, you cannot see light as it really is. If you're looking with the eyes of a nice, kindly old man like Jeffrey Hobson, the old theosophist in Ojai, who lived in his late 90s and drew light beings with beautiful pastel colors, if you're looking for that, you're not going to see them. It's like the old Irish statement, if you're looking for the fairy people, you're not going to see them. The realm of fairy, where they are real, does not exist in your imagination. It exists in reality. And so you have to scrape out the old patina of images that are not only out of date, but they're erroneous on several counts, and leave oneself clean. And in that purity, one can learn to see light. One can see the photon mass 0. And when one sees the photon mass 0, where would you see it? You can only see it in vision. The natural eye cannot see mass 0. But consciousness, in its visionary tremendousness, is able to see mass 0. And when the vision of the proton as mass 0 was resolved in reality, and it was first resolved in 1923 by Niels Bohr, he saw mass 0 photon in his vision. And he wrote a seminal paper called Atomic Theory and the Description of Nature. What is nature? One has to come up with a description which is fit and exact for what it is. In 1923, seeing mass 0 in his vision, seeing photon, seeing that a quantum of light is real both as a particle and as a wave, as an object and as a process at the very same time. That if you picked one, the other was no longer attentively there for you, but nevertheless continued to have reality. And you could as easily, with equal probability, pick the other side, and it would also be as apparent, and the other would also be as unapparent yet real. So that in the early 1920s, with the flappers dancing with the nice little hats, a few human beings were struck absolutely dumb by the fact of being able to see mass zero reality and being able to see light as it is quantumly. And in their vision, to use a visionary language, a magical language, to bring this out, to express what kind of reality actually is happening. And it is a reality where objectivity and process occur paired always. They're always paired. And so in order to be truthful, in order to be practical, in order to really get something done, one has to take into account both at once. And so a masterful attempt began to be made. And this masterful attempt was destructive as well as constructive at the same time. Every time something would be added in the vision, it had an equally destructive effect on the old classical basic common sense understanding of nature. Every time the differential realm grew an inch, the integral realm was erased an inch, and it became very fearful. Because literally what happens is that one is standing on the top of a ladder, and the next step onto another rung erases the rung below. And you find yourself eventually, in very short order, in the position that was described in the book that we took during the interval at the end of the integration cycle, The Cloud of Unknowing. That 14th century English Upanishad mystic said, one of the courageous elements of the spirit is not only to face the cloud of unknown above, but to realize that when you face it and go into it, then the cloud of unknown is also beneath you as well as above you. And you become completely suspended in the unknown. And this takes spiritual courage. Natural courage will never do this. It doesn't matter how much natural courage you have. It is ineffective, it is inoperative under those conditions. It takes a spirit being to step free. And one of the proofs of man's spiritual capacity came in the 1920s. Because whenever any single human being steps free into completely unknown visionary realm, it is absolute proof positive. You can count on it forever. You could build an entire heaven on that foundation. So Bohr is an extraordinary individual. The curious thing is that by 1979, having lived for 56 years, almost the old Stonehenge moon cycle. The largest Stonehenge moon cycle was 56 years, 4 times 19. Having lived with that zero mass visionary language for 56 years, human beings were able to finally see that another zero mass particle, which operates universally like the photon. And because of the function of this second zero mass particle, also in the family of gauge bosons, they called it a gluon because it glues together matter. That different atoms stay together because of a zero mass particle, the gluon, which is related in a very close family way to the photon, so that light and matter have a family resemblance. Light and matter go together. When one sees the moon, the half moon in the sky, and half the moon is crescent light and half the moon is dark. The half moon is perfect psychic symbol of deep spiritual truth. The reality of light is coextensive with the reality of invisible glue that holds everything together, cannot be seen. And the gluon, when it was seen, when it was understood to have zero mass, became basis of understanding how deep subatomic particles called quarks, how they mix together and make a soup. They make a stew. And the physics name for the stew is a plasma. And so one has, very soon after the 1979 discovery of it, this is printed in Heidelberg, 1985, just a few years later, the physics of the quark-gluon plasma. One of the real collector's items. One of the first statements in high-powered consciousness of nearly 21st century that plasma is not just a fourth state of matter. You don't just have solid, liquid, and gas. You also have plasma. You also have consciousness. There are many states. But that plasma somehow, because gluons and quarks together make this stew, make this plasma, one has the ability then to look at the cosmos in such a way that a plasma astrophysics is possible. And this plasma astrophysics comes from a meeting, the Swiss Society for Astrophysics and Astronomy in 1994, and this published in, I think, 95. No, 94. Published just very late last year. So this is the cutting edge. This is the cutting edge of where understanding is, that there is a plasma astrophysics, and that the cosmos, in a way, resembles very much the ancient notion, the ancient yogic notion that there is a dance of energy, and where the folds of the garment of the dancer of energy are, those folds are the materia that make the physical universe. That somehow what we're looking at when we look at material is that there is a focus there. That material is a focus. And that this focus actually is not a material focus, but an energy focus. So that the mass of the universe, which we take to be the only reality, is really the energy focus on the folds of the dancer. Did she not dance, and there were no folds, there would be no way whatsoever that our capacities could detect anything. Nor would we be. We are literally the children of a gorgeous dancer who guarantees that we are real because she does not stop her dancing. And whether you call her Lila or you call her a astrophysical plasma is something else. Gravity itself begins to have energy focus, so that there are things like gravitational lenses over vast distances, over billions of light years. One is reminded of the famous mantra of Carl Sagan, billions and billions. Over this enormous tapestry of visual cosmos, all of the energy forms have folds in them. And where these folds are, objective happenings occur, so that the physical reality of things is not that they are static, but that they are a focus of interpenetration of plasma motions. And what is curious, what is deeply true, what is like the way to test the wind, is that these energy focuses have a harmonic progression. Were they not to have a harmonic progression, there would be no way of understanding any kind of correspondence whatsoever. The very foundation of contrast and compare, of correspondence, of getting it or not getting it, or having any possibility of getting or not getting it, would not occur. So that when one comes to something like Niels Bohr, when one comes to the very beginnings of quantum theory, atomic theory and the description of nature, very early on, Bohr writes about the correspondence principle. Back in the 1920s, the correspondence principle. And he writes in the paragraph just before section 3, the correspondence principle, he writes about the erasing of the rungs, the destruction of the old thought, and in a very courageous, mature, visionary way, he writes, from all of these results, it seems to follow. Notice the probability. From all of these results, similar to how we've been talking, it seems to follow that in the general problem of the quantum theory, one is faced not with a modification of the mechanical and electrodynamic theories describable in terms of the usual physics concepts. One is not faced with a modification of them, but with an essential failure of the pictures in space and time on which the description of natural phenomena has been hitherto been based. In other words, under the stress and strain of a more precise reality, the old imaginative structure simply collapsed. It did not collapse from a failure of imagination. It did not collapse from a failure of its trueness or its efficacy. It collapsed because a higher energy level was achieved of reality, and on that energy level, imagination dissolves. Let's take something easy. Imagination is like sugar. You can have the sugar cube, but if you put it in hot water, it will dissolve. The quantum power of vision is like hot water that dissolves the sugar cubes of imagination. It's not that sugar is not real. It's not that sugar cubes are not real. Given the universe where we would use sugar cubes, they're as real as anything and they're extremely useful. They're true. And imagination is excellent. And in its level, in its horizon, in the mythic horizon, in a place where language obtains, where tribes are true, where culture is sweet, where feeling is very intelligent. On that horizon, imagination is as real and operative as anything. But look here, as Melville would say. Look here, you landlubbers. As soon as you step off the integration cycle, one step into the differential cycle, the imagination dissolves. So it doesn't dissolve in science, it dissolves already way back there in vision. Vision dissolves imagination. If you go back and listen to some of the tapes, if you play for yourself, if you relive some of your experience, you will see that almost all of the precariousness and promise at the same time of vision was that it is based on memory and not on imagination. One of the oldest wisdom statements is that you want to be saved? Then remember who you are. The wisdom statements never say, if you want to be saved, imagine who you are. They always caution you, stop imagining who you are and be who you are. Because as long as you simply imagine, you cannot be. Why can you not be? Because being is real on level of art, which is already much higher than vision. Much more energy is required for art than for vision. The artist is 1,000 times more powerful than the magician. But history as a process dissolves all that objectivity. And the cosmos is precipitated out of history, out of what we call history. History is not so innocent at all. And just as vision dissolves the sugar cube of imagination, history depends upon whether we can keep from dissolving our memory. Because if history dissolves our memory, we will have dissolved our imagination and dissolved our memory, and we will be left rather foolish, because we will have no operative way whatsoever to deal. So the differential consciousness deals with memory just like on the natural level we dealt with imagination. And we need that imagination. We need those levels. Without imagination, we don't have existence. We don't have a whole lot. We do not have mind without imagination. So no one's saying to throw it away. No one's saying jettison it. It doesn't operate on those higher energy frequencies. And in order to deal with the situation as it's handed to us now, we don't have any choice in the matter. We're there. We got the heat of that dragon's breath on the back of our necks. We have no choice at all. There is nowhere to run. And there's no way to fight it with the swords of imaginative combat. The Dungeons and Dragons level doesn't work. The medieval mythic ethos is inconsequential compared to that. But, as we will see in science, starting with Mary Leakey and Niels Bohr, men and women have already solved all of these problems. The way is open. As they used to say in the American West, The pass is over there. Get your wagons over and stake out place and get your land. All you have to do is grit it, get through it, and go and be there. Let's come back to Bohr. And Bohr, writing on the correspondence principle, in a paragraph just preparatory to it, writes, notice how we circle back, come back to it again. From these results, it seems to follow that in the general problem of the quantum theory, one is faced not with a modification of the mechanical and electrodynamical theories describable in terms of the usual physical concepts, but with an essential failure of the pictures in space and time on which the description of natural phenomena has hitherto been based. This failure appears also in a closer consideration of impact phenomena, in particular for impacts in which the time of collision is short compared to the natural periods of the atom, and for which very simple results are to be expected, according to the usual mechanical ideas. The postulate of stationary states would seem to be irreconcilable with any description of the collision in space and time based on the accepted ideas of atomic structures. Then comes in the correspondence principle. And next week I will try and read some of the correspondence principle. It's very difficult even 72 years later to hear on that level. But one of the things that comes out of this, in all of the seeming double talk and triple talk, one of the seminal ideas that comes out of this is harmonic. Just read the sentence here so that you can hear it. The demonstration of the asymptotic agreement between spectrum and motion gave rise to the formulation of the correspondence principle, according to which the possibility of every transition process connected with the emission of radiation is conditioned by the presence of a corresponding harmonic component in the motion of the atom. Where does that go? What does that mean? It means that structure has a harmonic capacity, and so we have to do something called harmonic analysis in order to get anywhere. So when one comes to 1993, the Princeton University Press, a whole series of monographs in harmonic analysis, and the third one here is Harmonic Analysis by the great Elias M. Stein. 1993, Higher Mathematics. Real variable methods, orthogonality, and oscillatory integrals. What does it mean? Where does it go? It means that when you come to physics monographs like time harmonic in electromagnetic fields in chiral media, one comes to illustrations, frontispieces like this, a mask taken from Maori culture. Why? What is a chiral media? Media is like a field, like a plasma field. A harmonic is that there's some kind of periodicity going on that's related together, and that there's some kind of key that's the secret to how they work. It means that in this universe, in this plasma astrophysics, one of the peculiarities of the folds of the garment of the energy dancer is that those folds tend to go either right or left, right-handed or left-handed, so that they are never confused. The folds always have some kind of striped pattern, some kind of resonance pattern to them, so that they're intelligible, so that high-powered vision sees the key to which the spectrum is tuned, and because one can see the tuning of the spectrum, one can then have one side of the key to the secret of movement, which you cannot see so easily. Because you can tune the folds of the garment, and by that you can compute how the dance is being conducted. That's what it really means. So that one finds a tremendous jump in capacity. Here's a little monograph from Princeton, and in 1955 it was on the cutting edge of the world. Mathematical Foundations of Quantum Mechanics by John von Neumann, the great brain behind computers. Johnny von Neumann. 40 years later, one finds, this published by Harvard University, David Albert, a physicist, Quantum Mechanics and Experience. One finds that after 40 years, right away, there is the deepening realization that a quantum plasma universe has a reality for us which we can use as a tool, but we have to learn two basic disciplines. One, to stop imagining that we know and to learn. And two, to get rid of the egotism that forbids us to learn because it will not let us let go what we imagine. And this education addresses both those issues all the time at the same time. And part of the reason why the education works, it simply works if you do it. You don't have to understand it. You just have to show up all the time. Because the education, like a good education, will work for you. You don't have to work for this education. This education will work for you. Not because I am so intelligent, but I stand not only on the shoulders of giants, but on the shoulders of the whole planet. To be able to hold up and say, all this effort was to get this pencil into your hand. Why don't you take it and start writing what you want to write? You can write whatever it is, because there's nothing written. There's no book of destiny. No one is corralled. Karma doesn't reach that deep. That's the message of the Buddhas. Karma doesn't reach as deep as you can. You can reach deeper. Karma does not extend beyond imagination. And already, as soon as memory begins to displace imagination, you're free from karma. Forget it. You don't have to worry about that. There are many, many other things, many, many other qualities. Let's come back for one little recap, and after the break, we'll go to Mary Leakey. The photon turns out to be a zero-mass particle. It turns out to have a family member called the gluon, which is also a zero-mass particle. But in this family of the photon and the gluon, there are particles like the Z particle having a mass of 93 gigavolts. In a different family, a family which are called the baryons, that have less energy mass. They have an energy mass. They're not zero, but they're not as refined, not as heavy, not as large as the Z or the W particles. In the baryons, the proton, which is in a different family from the photon, though they sound assonantly similar. The photon is in the gauge boson family, and it belongs to that family. Whereas the proton and the neutron belong to a family called the baryons. And it turns out that the proton and the neutron have very similar, not the same, but very similar energy mass. The energy mass of proton is 938.3 megavolts. If you don't have the 0.3, you don't have it. If you raise your extension of vision by technology so that you can sense 938 megavolts, you're not going to sense the proton. When you get to 938.3, there is the proton. Not only the proton, but its complement, the antiproton, have exactly the same energy mass. The neutron is only 983, so you will have come to be able to see neutrons just a hair before protons. And not only neutrons, but antineutrons. The machines are punking out. And so we'll stop there and we'll come back. In a time harmonic plasma, chirality occurs because there's a handedness. That is to say, when energy folds occur and you have matter, matter is the glint on the folds of energy resonances. Shapes appear. And those shapes have a particular quality. They always lend themselves to correspondence. And the correspondence cinches itself into objectivity because there's a preferential sidedness, handedness. Time has a future handedness, so that time has a direction preference. It prefers to go into the future. And the more it goes into the future, the more the past is erased, so that the present moment actually is a threshold of drawing something new and at the same time erasing something that was there. And so the pencil that the present is an eraser and a lead that are brought together until they become interfaced. And as the one writes, the other erases. So that the pencil of the present is a zero mass stylus. You heard it here first. No other yogi on the fucking planet can talk like that. Why? Why the Hollywood lingo? Because it's difficult to hear something completely new. It hasn't been said before. It's new. No one has said that. But the thought now is about 3 or 4 generations old in the sense of understanding what this does and what this means. And part of the difficulty in the science section of this course is to begin somewhere in all of this great complexity and give us some traction. Where can we start so that we can get somewhere? And the first thing that comes up is a warning sign. Skull and bones, poison sign. We're not getting anywhere. The whole lecture started out with, we have to caution ourselves against the habit, the addictive habit of getting somewhere. We don't need to get anywhere. If you have to put something in the purpose, in the goal, in the getting somewhere place, we're getting to more openness. That's all. We're just getting to more openness. We're moving differentially out. Well, isn't that confusing? No, it's not confusing at all. When one takes a look at light in order to deal with cosmic light, one deals with something called a light cone. And in order to calibrate its harmonic, one has a light cone gauge. And there are even formulas for this, mathematical formulas. And if one deals with an article on it called superstrings, one can abstract out a conclusion sentence that reads very mystically if you abstract it out. It reads, this amounts to inserting the equation of motion back into the action, which is now written in terms of the transverse components. If we linger and combine these ones, we obtain an action in terms of an index-free complex field. You want mysticism? You've got it. That movement can be analyzed in terms of an index-free complex field. What kind of language can do that? Very high conscious magic language. But this magic language, in order to work, does not depend upon rituals at all. There's no candle burning. What does it depend on? It depends on transformations, plural. It depends on understanding that vision, in order to have a movement, does not roll on images. The ball bearings of the movement of visionary language are not images. In mythic language, images are the ball bearings of the movement of language. What are the ball bearings of the movement of a magic language? They are transformations. Or you can use the shorter term, mathematic term, transforms. And it's been a couple hundred years, ladies and gentlemen, since the mathematics of transforms have been understood and moved. One of the few people that he genuinely envied, Napoleon decorated a Frenchman named Fourier because the Fourier transforms were the first time that anybody was able to express this in a very viable language, and still today. Here's a monograph by Chandrasekaran and Bochner, Fourier Transforms, published Princeton Mathematical Monograph, collector's item actually. First edition. Transforms. We know now by the late 20th century there are many transformational languages that can be used. We still use Fourier transforms. Why? Because they work. Because differential consciousness is able to manage very well, thank you, without any images whatsoever, but by remembering the transforms so that you can keep track for yourself. You can navigate with a kind of a spiritual freedom that could not even be imagined before. Nobody in those tribes, and those means all those tribes, was able to imagine this kind of movement. Why was Fourier able to do this? Why is somebody in Napoleonic times already able to do this? Because somebody before him had set the cosmos into a visionary field that was differentially truthful. Who was that person? That person was Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin? Yeah, Benjamin Franklin. He is the first person on this planet. Every planet has a first person who does something. And on this planet, the first person to understand electricity was Benjamin Franklin. In the Yale University edition, The Papers of Benjamin Franklin, it's very early in his works. It's volume 4. Experiments and observations on electricity made at Philadelphia in America by Mr. Benjamin Franklin. Later on, because of this, he was Dr. Franklin for the rest of the century. London, 1751. That's 244 years ago. And this book was published 8-9 years after the experiments. Over 250 years ago already, someone like Benjamin Franklin had understood that electricity is like, he called it at first, universal fluid. And by what he understands as fluid is very close to what we would understand today as plasma. That the electromagnetic plasma has qualities and quantities that are understandable to any degree of specificity. This is what makes science. And here, science has to be said. Science is a complementarity to symbol. Science and symbol complement each other. Together, they make a complementarity, which is real. Science and symbol. There's no way that a mathematical language, a mathematical magic language, can operate without symbols. But its operation, its efficacy, its operative efficacy is directly in proportion to the fact that the symbols do not have imaginary content, but have mnemonic capacity. It's the mnemonic functional capacity of symbols that is the useful part. The imagination content of symbols has to be diminished and finally emptied before the full potential of the differential mnemonic language of mathematics can be freed to work. Symbols are very peculiar. They work with imagination. They work with images. But when symbols work with images, they're like a jet plane. You have to have the atmosphere of this world for them to work. Otherwise, there's no way the jets are going to work. And jets only work to a certain altitude. Do you remember the scene in The Right Stuff where Sam Shepard playing Yeager takes the big jet of the time up as far as it'll go and the engine conks out? He has to free fall 12 miles back down to the ground and barely survives. And there aren't any jets that work, are never going to work, no matter how well you build them aerodynamically, they're going to work over 20 miles high. They need air to work. Symbols that have imaginative imagery content, imagination content, only work as long as there's the air of this world. But symbols can be transformed. They can be transformed from image base to memory-based. And memory-based symbols are like spaceships. They will work forever. You can not only go to the moon with them, you can go to any planet, any star, any galactic structure, any global cluster, wherever you want to go. They work anywhere. They work eternally. So that transforming symbols out of imagination into memory is functional process of, you can call it whatever you want to call it. Consciousness is a resonance of memory symbols working. And this consonance, because it's eternally, accurately what it is, that's the whole substrate upon which harmonic analysis takes place and can take place and does take place. And because of that, because of the mnemonic function of symbols, the principle of correspondence is a differentially applicable procedure. And what's wrong with all of the psychologies of the planet is that they're stuck thinking correspondence is due to image similarities. And that's just bad grammar. And somebody has to say it. You boys get an F. You didn't do your homework right. Because the human psyche doesn't operate in its healthfulness because images match up. That's good if you want to stay in the sandbox. It's good for sandbox play. But if you want to live in the cosmos, you have to make some transforms. That's what this education is about. The whole other half of this education is learning to play on cosmic scale. Learning to play consciousness. And in that cosmic scale, in consciousness, the objective and the process are always paired, and their pairedness is what would be, I think the language would be, a set of the real, a subset of the set of the real. They're always paired. So that process and object are always paired. And in a fundamental way, it's like the pairing of Tao and Te. The Tai Chi symbol is not a symbol of Tao, it's a symbol of Tao and Te paired together. If you read a translation of Lao Tzu, and it's called the Book of Tao, you would expect that it would only have half the book translated, because the other half of the book is on Te. Tao Te Ching. Not Tao Ching. Not Te Ching. Tao Te Ching. So that process and object as a pair are always together. Always together. You could even keep it as a mnemonic cue. The Shaolin fighting procedure, right? Because Tao Te are a pair, symmetry is a more profound process than polarity. Because symmetry is capable of transform, whereas polarity does not transform. Polarity does something else. Complementarity is what is real. Transformed polarity becomes symmetry. And symmetry, in its ultimate eternal reality is equanimous, but in terms of a dimensional condition, always chooses a handed quality. Right-handed, left-handed. Always has that chirality. Always. It's called on subatomic structural level spin. It always has a spin. And the spin isn't just in terms of holes. It's not like just positive one or negative one. It can be negative 1/2. So that if you come to something like The Particle Explosion, Oxford University Press, and you come to the back of the book and you come to Table of Particles, here's the family of the leptons. The leptons are electrons, positrons, and so forth. It lists, along with the charge, everyone knows the charge of an electron is -1, and therefore a positron would be +1. The spin of an electron is 1/2. The spin of a positron is 1/2. In fact, if you look at all the leptons, all have a spin of 1/2. If you look at the spin of the quarks, all the quarks have a spin of 1/2. None of them have 1 or -1. When you look at a photon, its spin is 1. All of the gauge bosons have a spin of 1. When you look to see what is the spin here of a proton, proton has a 1/2 spin. In fact, you look at all the baryons, they all have a spin of 1/2. So it's like a half spin. Seems characteristic of an awful lot of the universe. When you look at a family called the mesons, something very peculiar comes up. They have no spin at all. They have 0 spin, except for the very high energy particles, which have a spin of 1. Most of them have 0 spin. Pions, kaons, no spin at all. And it's not until you get up into the gigavolts that there begins to be a spin to mesons. So that most of the universe, most of the stuff of the universe, the building blocks of the universe, they have a preferential spin of 1/2. Which means that when matter occurs, matter being the glint on the folds of energy, form harmonics. When matter is operative there, and you accept the conditions of matter as the stage props within which you're going to live, you have to take into account the fact that under these conditions, it's going to have this kind of preferentiality. And if you know that, then you can begin to talk about computing karma. Otherwise, you don't have a clue in the world. You think remembering some past life and some kind of event is going to give you a hedge on that kind of complexity? Come on. The variables are asymptotic. There's no way. Whereas this other way, one can navigate quite well, thank you. And there are men and women who've put the time in and are learning how to navigate. And it's not in some secret kind of club. It's out there. It's a very limited club because it takes a little work to get used to it. And this education is all about getting used to the dimensions of the real that are available. Some of it is, by now, quite old. Benjamin Franklin's work is 250 years ago. Maxwell's work, upon which a lot of electromagnetic theory is based. Almost all of Bohr's work is founded on Maxwell. His work goes back over 100 years now. When one comes to the recently published volume 2 of the scientific papers of James Clerk Maxwell, one finds here on page 160 a fragment of the draft of his article, A Dynamical Theory of the Electromagnetic Field, written in the summer of 1864, written when Lincoln was still president, when the Civil War was still going on. This die-hard Scotsman's already writing A Dynamical Theory of the Electromagnetic Field, one of the great papers of the world, referred to by Bohr again and again, and absolutely essential. Out of Maxwell's work came realization that our old imaginative mind was severely limited, had a ceiling on it that was very low, and that we couldn't see anything above that ceiling. It was like living in a fog bank. That as long as man had lived, he lived within a fog bank, and that he had no idea that the world is not foggy, but that it's just a fog bank above which is an open sky. And with Maxwell's work, Bohr was able, some 2-3 generations later, to be able to look up and see something that had not been realized except by the highest mystics before him. He was able to look up into the sky and not see anything. When asked, if one could have asked him, Niels, what do you see? He would have said, I see sky, open sky. Nothing else. In the Bhagavad Gita, at the crunch, where Krishna is eliciting from Arjuna the courage to be, he reminds him by allusion that when he was taking archery lessons from Drona, the great archery teacher, in an earlier part of the epic, the Mahabharata, the Gita being set in part 6, the 6th Parvan of the 18 Parvans of the Mahabharata, the Great War. Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita reminds Arjuna by an elicited memory mnemonic cue. You remember when your teacher Drona was teaching you how to aim precisely in the universe, how your other 4 brothers were there with bows and arrows ready to shoot, and there was a target there in the field set up on a pole. It was a wooden eagle. And Krishna asked your brothers, what do you see? And a couple of them said, I see very clearly the eagle on the pole above me. And he dismissed them. And Drona asked another one of your brothers, what do you see? And he said, well, I see the eagle's head. And he dismissed him. And the third, Yudhishthira, who became the king, said in response to the question, what do you see? He said, I see the eye of the eagle. But when Arjuna was asked, what do you see? He said, I see nothing. And immediately Drona said, shoot. You can never miss because you don't shoot at the target. The target and the arrow and the archer are all one. You saw nothing because you're all part of the same thing. I remember one time, Manly Hall in an evening of stories. said he was out with the Morongo Indians out near Banning in the early 20s. He was taking part in a investment in a gold mine, which didn't pan out at that time. And the old Morongo Indians were showing how they used to survive out in the desert, the Mojave, by being able to shoot game. And there's not much game in the Mojave, so you have to be very good shot, very quick. And so Manly, who had read up on archery, was going to take part, got the bow and arrow all set and aimed and everything, and the old Morongo Indian archery teacher said to him, no. You don't aim the arrow. You're starved to death. You shoot from the hip. You literally just shoot from the hip. But you shoot when you're at one with the game. You never miss. And there's no way that you're going to shoot that game unless you need that for life. And he said he learned to shoot like an Indian. Like Arjuna, who saw nothing. You have to be able to look like Niels Bohr at the sky and see that it is open sky. There are no angels there. There are no forms there. There's nothing imaginary there. There's only there what is really there. And you can be there with it to such an extent that one would not even ask the question, what do you see? Because the seer and the seen would be equanimous to the point closer than identity. Identity is A equals A. What's closer than identity is an asymmetrical A. And so under the conditions of time-space, in the chiral folds of matter glinting on the harmonics of energy modulations, one can go deeper than identity, deeper than 1 equals 1. One can go to 1. Recently there was a day commemorating at-one-ment, Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, at-one-ment, of there not being separations. In order for there to be an image, the image must be different from the background. All images structurally are only contingently appearance present because they are distinct from the background. And when the background absorbs the images, so that there's no foreground, no background, there's just background. There are no images. Someone like Bohr was able to see the quantum sky just as it was because someone before him, like Maxwell, had devised a language, a theoretical language, already at the time Lincoln was president, ladies and gentlemen. It's almost ancient history. It's nothing new, but it's indispensable. Because Maxwell's mathematical magic language was able to bring down a quality where electromagnetic field was able to be talked about in a non-imaginary way. Some of the titles, the very first title, the subtitle, is specific resistance. And the resistance is given a mathematical quantification. There's a universal resistance which allows for the dynamical aspects of the electromagnetic field to be dealt with at all. What is the cue? The cue is don't worry about your resistances. They're a part of what is essential under conditionalities to have anything to deal with. They're not anything to get rid of. They're part of what you work with to navigate. Then there's such a thing as electric elasticity. Did you know electricity is elastic? Highly. Electromagnetic fields are very elastic, tremendously. And part of the work that came out of Maxwell's work way back then slowly came into maturity after a couple of generations, so that it was able to be seen, it was able to be understood that somehow in this universe that there was an energy continuum that was so pervasive it was like open sky, and that for a long time it simply couldn't be seen because it was omnipresent. It was so pervasive everywhere. And that background was called black body radiation. That when the universe began with tremendous burst, Big Bang, and slowly cooled and cooled and cooled and cooled. And that what makes the space in between planets and stars and everything seem dark is seemingly absence of light, when this is not true at all. The universe is so dazzling that it literally is so bright that we only see the negative of it. Natural eyes cannot see that much light. They're staggered into numbness. The egotistical mind is numbed into zombie-like stupidity in face of glory of the universe. But the black body radiation finally was able, on basis of Maxwell's magic language, able to be posited that somehow there is a temperature to the universe in the background, 2.73 kelvins. The ability to see that background radiation, that black body radiation, as something meant that the visionary capacity of man had exceeded the background of the universe. Because you cannot see the background radiation of the universe, no matter how powerful your mathematics, until you have a visionary capacity that exceeds it, and that form can occur. So it was an indication. The wind was blowing that man's spirit had somehow enlarged itself beyond the physical universe in actual practical fact. This is a tremendous achievement. Because these are men and women very similar to us. They're not very different from us at all. It meant that a step of evolution had taken place, that men and women like us are capable of navigating and operating with capacity that used to belong to few super yogis. Where's the evolution? The evolution is there in that spirit. So we can fold the books today on Bohr for a while. Let's come to Mary Leakey, because Mary Leakey is one of the great masterminds of evolution. It isn't just Charles Darwin with his idea of evolution and his book on Origin of Species. But it's largely due to someone like Mary Leakey that scale of evolutionary development becomes applicable to us as a species. It isn't just that monkeys have this evolution, and reptiles have this evolution, and amoebas and protozoas. It's that man himself, our species, has a tremendous long evolution. We're not just recent. We're millions of years of sophistication. We're a pencil so fine that the lead and the eraser have come together in our species, which is why our species has a paired double name, Homo sapiens sapiens, twice. Wisdom, wisdom, man. Because the lead and the eraser have come together. We're wise in both ways. We're wise to write something completely new, and we're wise to erase the old completely. That our species has this incredible refinement, gorgeous like the rarest of all possible jewels. An organic threshold that is able to hold in complete equanimity at the same time creation and destruction. It's like a Shiva-like power. But that when it comes into play, it always is going to take some kind of handedness, some kind of preference. And so it takes a consciousness to have forethought, to have pronoia, to see which way it's going to go and to make sure that there's a balance so that one doesn't get caught in a devolution. Because if one is just subconscious about it, or even worse, unconscious about it, the use of divine powers of consciousness have 50-50 chance of going astray. And in fact, when one knows the choreography of chirality, they have 100% chance of going astray. You have no chance at all unless you consciously, through foresight, set it up so that your processes are going to be able to work in the way that you need so that you can navigate. This is not being taught anywhere in the world except in few high-powered graduate classes of astrophysics, mathematics. Yeah, it's difficult. No, we don't have to study it on that level. Yes, we can bring it into an educational procedure, and that's what we're doing. Yeah, it is a struggle, but hunting groups like ours have always been successful. Millions of years ago, there were male-female creatures related to us, and they were successful at their level. We can be successful at our level. We have all that we need together to be successful hunting groups. And just like they had to find a way to bring down big lizards, we have to find a way to bring down big ignorance. We can do that. Can do that. Notice that differential and integral and differential always go together. They're a subset of the real. So that nature and ritual, we saw, went together. Myth and symbol went together. Vision and art went together. History and science go together. And that's very difficult to get because there's nothing to get. There's an operative idea there, but it's not a purpose. It's not a goal. It's not something to get. It's something to let be. And yet one has to let it be, not in a hands-off way, but in a hands-on way. And that's where the art of education comes in. Because if you just let it be, it's not only a 50-50 chance that it'll go wrong, it's a 100% chance. It'll never go right. So that some of the men and women like ourselves, about the time that quantum theory was beginning to filter down, the French existentialists of the Second World War like Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, writing statements like, man apparently is condemned to be free. And that makes the universe absurd. And people of 2 generations ago, on cutting edge of consciousness, had to face that particular wall, that particular threshold of anxiety. And they realized that a couple generations before them, that had been faced already. Whole generation before Maxwell comes someone like Søren Kierkegaard. When Lincoln was still a teenager, already is writing about fear and trembling of dealing with that existential threshold. And he was told by the Danes of his time, you'd be better off just being a good Christian. And his response was, I'd like to be a good Christian. It's very difficult. There is a quality that by 1995, almost the 21st century, there's a quality that's there that many men and women have left us legacies and treasures. We're only taking two as a focus right now, Bohr and Mary Leakey. For Bohr, we talked about how the magical language of mathematics was visionary capacity for him. For Mary Leakey, it was being taken as a young girl to southern France and seeing the Paleolithic cave paintings. She was just a girl. And something happened to her. A transform was elicited. The juices started flowing in her. Her parents and an old French archaeological abbey was there, but for her the magic was that the ancient Paleolithic art elicited from her a comprehension that she didn't know that she had before. And once those juices were flowing, she never lost the taste for being able to see something that was invisible to other people. And later on in her life, when she married Louis Leakey and went to Africa for the very first time out in the field, number one, being out in the field, just strolling out, she found an artifact that was millions of years old of man. It was labeled artifact number 2. Leakey had found the first one a few years before, and it was artifact number 1, OH2. OH3 was found in 1959, 26 years later. How does anyone have the courage, the guts, the outrageousness to base a whole life on something that you didn't find the second step at all until more than half a mature life had gone by? Where does the certainty come from? It comes from knowing that what you have seen is real. And she knew, even as a girl, that what she was seeing was real. She wasn't seeing ancient Paleolithic art that was now old. She was seeing a quality of the present that was alive in her. She understood what was there. She was at one with the Paleolithic artists. And so she was able to follow that path. And extraordinarily, when she was an old woman, she's still alive. About 10 years ago, as an old woman, she literally found the footprints in the shale from millions of years ago. She uncovered at a site called Leakey in Africa, not far from Old Duvet Gorge. She found a site where a woman and a child had walked across a semi-molten field of lava eruption from volcanoes millions of years ago, and their footprints were left and covered by ash a few hours later. What happened to them, we don't know. But Mary Leakey found those sets of footprints millions of years old. And it's the most graphic evidence we have of not ancient man, not even archaic man, but of human beings so old that one has to call them geologic man. That we have been around as physical beings, as chiral glints off a spiritual dance form, which yields our reality under the conditions of time-space for millions of years. So when you're being invited to learn, it's not that difficult. 3 months is nothing to apply oneself to something millions of years in the making. I guess that's stealing from Jurassic Park advertising, isn't it? In Hollywood, we steal. More next week.